The most dangerous person in a room filled with predators is the one they no longer see. For 5 years, Josephine Dubois had perfected the art of being invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of a life that was once hers. Tonight at the Metropolitan Arts Foundation Gala, she was just a footnote in her ex-husband's gilded story, the forgotten first wife. They looked at her with pity, their whispers like wasps in the crystal-laden air. They thought they knew her story, a woman left behind. They were about to learn they hadn't even read the first chapter. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, a thick slice of ivory cardstock nestled amongst utility bills and junk mail. The embossed crest of the Metropolitan Arts Foundation felt like a relic from another lifetime. For Josephine Dubois, it was exactly that. For 15 years she had co-chaired this very event alongside her then-husband Preston Carmichael. She had chosen the floral arrangements, debated the merits of salmon versus sea bass, and soothed the ruffled feathers of New York's most demanding patrons. Her name, once etched onto the planning committee list in elegant script, was now conspicuously absent, replaced by another Bianca Davenport Carmichael. Josie stared at the invitation, her thumb tracing the sharp edges. It wasn't a courtesy, it was a power play. A summons to witness the finality of her replacement. Preston, a man who built his empire. Carmichael Properties, on hostile takeovers and crushing his rivals, applied the same tactics to his personal life. He didn't just end their 20-year marriage. He sought to erase it, to bulldoze the foundation of their shared history and build a newer, glossier monument on its ruins. Her friends, the few who had weathered the storm of her messy public divorce, urged her to throw it away. "Why would you subject yourself to that, Josie?" Her friend Chloe had asked, her voice laced with genuine concern over a lukewarm coffee. "It's a snake pit. You know what they'll be like." Josie knew. She could already hear the symphony of feigned sympathy, the carefully crafted questions designed to sting. "How are you holding up? It must be so hard for you. Bianca looks simply radiant, doesn't she?" Each phrase a poisoned dart aimed at the heart of her pride. For 5 years since the divorce she had lived a life of quiet austerity, a stark contrast to the opulence she'd once known. She'd sold the Hamptons Beach House and the Aspen Ski Lodge, her half of the settlement, and poured the money into something she told no one about. She moved into a modest but elegant brownstone in Greenwich Village, swapping society columns for textbooks on quantitative analysis and trading her Cartier watch for a sleek, functional smartwatch that was perpetually feeding her data. The world. Preston's world assumed she was living off the dregs of her settlement, a fallen socialite clinging to faded memories. They thought she spent her days tending to her small garden and lunching with other divorcees. In a way, she cultivated this misconception. Anonymity had become her armor. But the invitation felt different. It wasn't just a reminder of what she had lost. It was a challenge she was for the first time ready to meet. She wasn't the same trembling woman who had signed the divorce papers with a hand so unsteady her own signature was nearly illegible. The fire that Preston had tried so hard to extinguish had not died out. It had merely been banked, gathering heat in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to roar back to life. "I think I'll go," she had told Chloe, a small, enigmatic smile playing on her lips. Chloe had stared at her. "Are you sure? What will you wear? What will you say?" "I have a few ideas," Josie had replied, her gaze distant, fixed on a future only she could see. Now standing before the full-length mirror in her bedroom, she assessed her reflection. She had chosen her attire with the precision of a military strategist. It wasn't a gown from a famous Parisian atelier, the kind Bianca would be wearing. It was a custom piece from a little-known designer, a column of midnight blue silk that was breathtaking in its simplicity. It didn't scream for attention with sequins or feathers. It commanded it with its flawless cut and quiet confidence. Her only jewelry was a pair of diamond studs, small, but of a clarity so perfect they seemed to burn with an inner light, and a simple platinum band on her right hand. Her dark hair was swept up in a clean, elegant chignon, revealing the graceful line of her neck. She looked nothing like the mousy, accommodating wife Preston had molded her into, nor did she look like a woman desperate to reclaim her youth. She looked like herself, finally and completely. Taking a deep breath, she picked up the small clutch from her bed. Inside, nestled next to her phone and a single lipstick, was a small, unassuming hard drive. It was her life's work, the culmination of 5 years of sleepless nights, complex algorithms, and unwavering focus. It was the source of her silence, and tonight, it was the source of her strength. The taxi dropped her off a block away from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, allowing her to approach on foot. The familiar facade was ablaze with light, a beacon for the city's elite. Limousines and black cars lined the curb, disgorging men in bespoke tuxedos and women draped in jewels that could fund a small country. The air buzzed with the chatter of the powerful and the privileged. For a fleeting moment, a pang of the old insecurity hit her. She was walking back into the lion's den voluntarily. But then she straightened her shoulders, the cool silk of her dress a second skin. She was no longer prey. She was simply waiting. Stepping into the great hall was like diving into a glittering, turbulent sea. The roar of 100 conversations, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the ambient music from a string quartet on the balcony washed over her. The scent of 1,000 different perfumes mingled in the air, a cloying cloud of wealth. Towering floral arrangements, extravagant creations of white orchids and hydrangeas reached towards the vaulted ceilings. It was a scene she knew intimately, yet seeing it now as an outsider was a profoundly alienating experience. For the first 15 minutes, her strategy of quiet elegance worked. She was a ghost. People's eyes slid over her, registering a woman who didn't fit the usual mold of extravagant display, and then moved on, searching for a more important face, a more powerful connection. She procured a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and found a relatively quiet spot near the base of a towering Egyptian statue, allowing her to observe without being the center of attention. She watched Preston and Bianca hold court near the entrance. Preston, silver-haired and impeccably tailored in a Tom Ford tuxedo, looked every bit the master of the universe. He radiated an aura of unshakable confidence, his laugh booming across the marble floor. At his side, Bianca was a vision in fire engine red, a flamboyant Oscar de la Renta creation that demanded to be seen. A necklace of staggering diamonds, which Josie recognized from a recent Sotheby's auction catalog, was wrapped around her throat. They were a power couple in the truest sense, a sun around which lesser celestial bodies orbited. The whispers started subtly, a sideways glance from Beatrice Atherton, a notorious gossip columnist whose pen could make or break a social reputation. A pointed finger from a group of women Josie had once served on a charity board with. The ripples of her presence began to spread. "Is that Josephine Carmichael? I thought she'd moved to Florida. My God, what is she doing here? How brave of her. That dress is rather plain, isn't it?" The word brave was used like a weapon, dripping with condescension. It was the word one used for a lost cause, a hopeless endeavor. Josie kept her expression placid, taking a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne. She had anticipated this. It was merely the opening salvo. The first direct confrontation came as expected from Bianca. She detached herself from Preston's side, gliding through the crowd like a shark, her red dress a trail of blood in the water. She was flanked by two of her acolytes, women whose loyalty was bought with invitations and social proximity. "Josephine!" Bianca purred, her smile as wide and artificial as a pageant queen's. "I was so surprised to see you accepted our invitation. We weren't sure you'd be comfortable." The "we" was a masterful touch, immediately aligning herself with Preston and casting Josie as the outsider. "Bianca," Josie replied, her voice calm and even. She didn't offer a handshake. "The foundation has always been important to me. It's good to see its traditions are being upheld." It was a neutral statement, but with a subtle barb, a reminder that Josie's connection to this world predated Bianca's by 2 decades. Bianca's smile tightened fractionally. "Well, of course. Preston is more generous than ever. He just funded the entire new West Wing renovation. We're calling it the Carmichael Wing." She gestured vaguely with a hand heavy with rings. "But I'm sure you read about that in the papers." The unspoken addendum hung in the air from your lonely little apartment while we changed the world. "I must have missed that," Josie said with a cool indifference that seemed to needle Bianca more than any outburst would have. One of Bianca's friends, a woman named Tiffany, chimed in, her gaze sweeping over Josie's simple dress. "It's been ages, Josephine. We were just saying how you've been living the quiet life. It must be so relaxing to not have to worry about all this." She gestured to the opulent chaos around them. The pressure to keep up. It was a classic backhanded compliment designed to frame Josie's life as small and insignificant. A life without pressure was a life without importance. Josie met Tiffany's gaze directly. "There are different kinds of pressure, Tiffany. You'd be surprised what can be accomplished when you're not distracted by the color of next season's Birkin bag." The shot was so direct, so unexpected, that Tiffany flushed a deep crimson. Bianca's eyes narrowed. The docile, agreeable Josephine they remembered was gone. In her place was a stranger, one who met their attacks with a polished, unyielding shield. "Well?" Bianca said, recovering quickly and adopting a tone of pity. "We're all so glad you could make it. Do try to enjoy yourself. The auction later has some lovely little pieces. Perhaps you can pick up a small souvenir." She turned and swept away, her red dress rustling with triumphant indignation, her friends trailing in her wake. The encounter left a small, silent crater in the nearby conversations. People had seen the exchange, noted the tension. The ghost was no longer invisible. She had spoken, and her voice carried an unfamiliar edge. Josie remained by the statue, her heart beating a little faster now. The first test was over. She hadn't flinched. She finished her champagne, the bubbles a pleasant sting on her tongue. She could feel the weight of the hard drive in her clutch, a cool, dense rectangle of potential energy. The evening was just beginning, and the main event was yet to come. An hour bled into 2. Josie navigated the crowded room with a newfound purpose. She didn't seek out conversations, but she no longer avoided them. When an older gentleman, a board member named Robert Finney, who had always shown her kindness, approached her, she engaged him in a lively discussion about the stock market. "I've been dabbling," she said with a wry smile when he asked how she spent her days. "Oh, anything interesting?" Robert asked politely, likely picturing a few shares of Apple or Disney. "I'm more interested in predictive analytics, specifically identifying systemic fragilities in high-leverage debt models," she replied, watching his eyebrows shoot up in surprise. She excused herself before he could ask more, leaving him with a look of stunned curiosity. The main course was served, and Josie found her assigned table. It was as she'd expected, in social Siberia, table 42, tucked away in a corner near the service entrance, populated by junior board members, out-of-town donors, and a smattering of other social undesirables. The message was clear: you are here, but you are not with us. She didn't mind. It gave her a panoramic view of the room, of the intricate dance of power and ego on full display. Her table mates were too intimidated or too uninterested to speak to her, leaving her in a bubble of isolation. It was from this vantage point that she watched Preston finally make his move. He'd been observing her from afar, a predator sizing up its prey. Now, with the main course plates being cleared, he began to make his way toward her, Bianca clinging to his arm. He wasn't walking. He was processing a king moving through his court. People parted before him. He stopped at her table, forcing everyone present to crane their necks. The chatter around them died down, creating a pocket of intense, focused silence. "Josie!" He began, his voice a smooth, deep baritone that had once soothed her and now made her skin crawl. It was the voice he used for public addresses, charming, magnanimous, and utterly false. "I'm glad you came. Bianca and I were hoping you would." "Preston," she said, her voice even. She didn't stand. She simply looked up at him, forcing him to address her from above. It was a small but significant act of defiance. "It's good to see you out and about." He continued, his eyes doing a slow, insulting sweep of her and the table. "I know things have been different for you. I hope you're managing all right." The concern in his voice was a paper-thin veneer over a solid core of condescension. He was performing for the audience he'd gathered, playing the part of the gracious ex-husband. "I'm managing just fine, thank you," she said. Bianca, seizing her moment, leaned in. "Preston has been so worried. He still feels responsible for you, you know. It's just his way." She patted his arm possessively. "That's why we wanted to make sure you had a seat tonight, even with everything going on." Before Josie could respond, Preston raised his hand, silencing the room. A server, clearly pre-instructed, handed him a microphone. Oh God, Josie thought, he's going to make a speech. "Friends, colleagues," Preston boomed, his voice now amplified throughout the grand hall. "If I could have your attention for just a moment." He smiled, a flash of perfectly white teeth. "Tonight is about philanthropy. It's about giving back, and it's about appreciating what we have." His eyes found Josie's, and he held her gaze, a cruel glint in his eyes. "Some of you may know my company Carmichael Properties just closed the biggest deal in its history, a multi-billion-dollar acquisition of downtown commercial real estate." A wave of applause rippled through the room. He held up a hand for silence. "Success isn't just about moving forward," he said, his voice dropping into a more intimate, seemingly reflective tone. "It's also about remembering where you came from. It's about remembering those who were part of the journey, even if they couldn't keep up with the pace." The entire room knew who he was talking about. It was a public execution cloaked in the language of magnanimity. He was painting her as a relic, a starter wife who couldn't handle the rarefied air of his success. He was framing his new life with Bianca as an evolution and her as an extinction event. "So I'd like to make a special donation tonight," Preston announced, his eyes still locked on Josie. "In honor of new beginnings, and in recognition of the past." He paused for dramatic effect. "I will be donating $100,000 to the Foundation's outreach program." More applause, this time louder. It was a generous sum, but to him it was pocket change. The value wasn't in the money, it was in the statement. "And," he added, turning slightly to address Josie more directly, a sickeningly pitying smile on his face, "I'd like to personally dedicate this donation to my former wife Josephine, to wish her well in her simpler endeavors." The humiliation was absolute. It washed over Josie in a hot, suffocating wave. He had put her on display in a museum of her own past, labeled her as a quaint artifact, and then paid a pittance for the privilege. The faces around her were a blur of pity, morbid curiosity, and thinly veiled contempt. She could feel Bianca's triumphant gaze burning into her. For a single terrifying second, the old Josie threatened to surface, the one who would have shrunk in her chair, tears welling in her eyes, and simply endured it. The one who would have fled the room in shame. But then she felt it. Not the familiar sting of shame, but the ice-cold clarity of rage. A pure, clean anger that burned away all the fear and self-doubt. He thought he was delivering the killing blow. He had no idea he had just handed her the sword. She looked up at him, past the microphone, past the smug smile, and into the eyes of the man who had underestimated her so profoundly. And for the first time that night, she smiled. A genuine, confident, and utterly terrifying smile. Preston, caught off guard by her reaction, faltered for a second. He had expected tears, not defiance. He quickly recovered, ending his speech with a flourish and handing the microphone back. As the applause for his generosity echoed around her, Josie picked up her wine glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and waited. The auction was next, and the game was about to change. The dinner plates were cleared, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. The polite hum of conversation was replaced by a more focused, competitive buzz. The live auction was the main event of the evening, a chance for the city's wealthiest to publicly display their generosity and, more importantly, their financial dominance. The auctioneer, a charismatic man named Simon, took the stage, his rapid-fire patter immediately commanding the room's attention. The first few items went for predictable, albeit staggering sums. A week on a private yacht in the Mediterranean sold for $200,000. A private dinner cooked by a Michelin-starred chef went for $75,000. Josie watched impassive as Preston and Bianca bid on a few items, winning a case of rare Bordeaux for a price that could have funded a college education. They were ostentatious, raising their paddle with dramatic flair, ensuring everyone saw their largesse. Josie remained perfectly still at table 42. She didn't touch her paddle. Her table-mates, having witnessed her public humiliation, now treated her with a wide berth as if her bad luck were contagious. She was an island of stillness in a sea of frantic bidding. Then Simon introduced the marquee item of the night. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his voice resonating with excitement, "for our final item this evening, a piece of history, a one-of-a-kind, breathtaking piece of art. We have the distinct honor of auctioning Starlight on the Hudson, the final masterpiece by the late celebrated artist Arthur Finch." A hushed awe fell over the room as two assistants unveiled the painting on an easel. It was magnificent, a sprawling atmospheric canvas that captured the New York skyline at dusk, not as a collection of buildings but as a living, breathing entity of light and shadow. It was Finch's last work before his death, and its emotional weight and artistic genius were palpable even from across the room. "Mr. Finch was a patron of this museum," Simon continued, "and his estate has generously donated this painting with a starting bid of $500,000. Josie's heart gave a single hard thump. Arthur Finch had been her favorite artist. Years ago, she and Preston had attended one of his gallery openings. She had been mesmerized by his work, but Preston had dismissed it as too sentimental. Owning a Finch had been a secret dream of hers. "Do I have 500,000? Simon called out. Immediately a paddle went up at a front table, then another. The bidding quickly escalated, jumping in increments of $50,000. 700,000. "Do I have 750? Yes, from the gentleman in the back. $800,000 from Mr. Williamson." Preston had been biding his time. Now he entered the fray. He didn't raise his paddle. He simply caught Simon's eye and gave a crisp, authoritative nod. $1 million. Simon announced, his voice ringing with triumph. "The bid is $1 million from Mr. Preston Carmichael." A ripple of impressed murmurs went through the crowd. It was a power move, a bid designed to intimidate others into submission. For a moment it worked. The other bidders hesitated. Williamson lowered his paddle. $1 million going once," Simon said, milking the drama. "Going twice." And then from the forgotten corner of the room a paddle rose. It was paddle number 427, Josie's paddle. Simon the auctioneer squinted, momentarily confused. "I have $1,050,000 from table 42? He sounded unsure, as if he might have made a mistake. Every head in the room swiveled in her direction. Josie sat serenely, her paddle held high, her expression unreadable. Preston stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief which quickly curdled into amusement. He thought it was a pathetic gesture, a desperate attempt to reclaim a shred of dignity. He turned to Bianca and whispered something, and they both shared a condescending laugh. He raised his hand again, not even bothering with the paddle. $2 million, he said, his voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. He was ending this little game now. The room gasped. A $2 million bid. It was an absurd escalation. $2 million from Mr. Carmichael. Simon shouted, his professional poise barely concealing his glee. A stunning show of generosity. Is there any advance on $2 million? Josie's paddle did not waver. Simon looked back at her, his eyebrows raised. Ma'am? $2,500,000, Josie said. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried across the silent room with perfect clarity. The laughing stopped. Preston's smile vanished. This was no longer a joke. He was being publicly challenged by the woman he had just publicly humiliated. His jaw tightened. He lifted his paddle decisively. 3 million. The words were clipped angry. Without a moment's hesitation, Josie's paddle stayed up. 3,500,000, she said, her voice still impossibly calm. A frantic, excited energy now gripped the hall. This wasn't about philanthropy anymore. It was a duel. A bitter personal battle was playing out in real time with a masterpiece painting as the weapon. The crowd was no longer watching an auction. They were watching a blood sport. Preston was livid. His face was flushed, his knuckles white where he gripped his paddle. He had intended to cap off his night of triumph by acquiring the evening's grand prize. He would not be denied, especially not by her. 5 million, he roared, getting to his feet. The entire room erupted in gasps and frantic whispers. $5 million for a painting even a Finch was unheard of. Bianca looked pale, tugging at Preston's arm, but he shook her off. His pride was on the line. The room was silent, all eyes on Josie. They expected her to fold. This was a billionaire's game, and she was a relic with a finite divorce settlement. She had made her point, but now she was out of her depth. Josie slowly, gracefully lowered her paddle. A collective sigh of relief and disappointment went through the room. Preston smirked, a look of smug victory settling on his features as he sat back down. He had won. He had put her back in her place. $5 million going once, Simon yelled, his heart pounding. Going twice. As his gavel began to fall, Josie raised her hand again. She wasn't holding the paddle. She was holding a microphone given to her by a stunned but savvy event organizer who sensed a historic moment was unfolding. She stood up, and the simple, elegant lines of her dress made her seem taller, more imposing than anyone remembered. She looked directly at the auctioneer, but her words were for the entire room. For Preston. 10 million, she said. A sound like a thunderclap of shock rolled through the hall. People gasped. Some stood up to get a better look. $10 million. It was an impossible number. It was a statement of such overwhelming financial power that it defied comprehension. Preston Carmichael looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. His face was ashen, his mouth slightly agape. He stared at her not with anger anymore, but with sheer, unadulterated shock. Simon the auctioneer had to grip his podium to steady himself. I'm sorry, madam, did you say 10 million? I did, Josie confirmed, her voice steady as steel. The murmuring in the room was now a deafening roar. Who is she? Where did she get that kind of money? Is this a joke? Robert Finney, the kind board member from earlier, stood up. Simon, who is the bidder? For the record, state the bidder's name. Simon looked at his list, then at Josie. A dawning realization on his face. He had her listed as Josephine Dubois, her maiden name, which she had reclaimed after the divorce. But Josie answered for him. She looked directly at Preston, a cold fire in her eyes, and spoke into the microphone, her voice echoing in the stunned silence. The bid is $10 million, she said, her voice ringing with 5 years of suppressed fury and vindication. From Josephine Dubois, founder and CEO of Aura Analytics. If the bid had been a shockwave, the name of her company was the earthquake that followed. Aura Analytics. The mysterious new paradigm-shifting tech firm that had been the talk of Wall Street for the past 8 months. A company that used a revolutionary predictive algorithm to analyze market vulnerabilities. A company whose founder was notoriously private, known only by the initial J. Dubois. A company that just last week had closed a funding round that valued it at $17 billion. The pieces clicked into place across the room with audible gasps. The quiet, pitiable ex-wife, the simple dress, the modest life. It had all been a lie. A carefully constructed camouflage. She wasn't the ghost at the feast. She owned the feast. Preston Carmichael, the master of the universe, looked at his ex-wife, and for the first time he saw her. Not the woman he'd left behind, but a titan of industry who held a paddle for a $10 million bid as casually as if she were ordering coffee. He was no longer looking at his past. He was staring at a future he could have never imagined, a future that was about to run him over. The painting was hers. The night was hers. And the look in her eyes promised that this was only the beginning. The auctioneer's gavel fell with a final definitive crack that seemed to echo the shattering of Preston Carmichael's world. Sold for $10 million to Ms. Josephine Dubois. The hall erupted not in polite applause but in a cacophony of frantic, astonished conversation. The carefully maintained facade of high society decorum had crumbled. People were on their feet, craning their necks, pulling out their phones. Reporters who were covering the social aspects of the gala were now scrambling their journalistic instincts, screaming that the real story of the night had just detonated from a table in the back corner. In an instant, Josie's isolation evaporated. Table 42 became the epicenter of the universe. A swarm of people descended, their faces a mixture of awe, disbelief, and naked opportunism. Robert Finney was the first to reach her, his face beaming. "Josephine, my God, Aura Analytics. I've been reading about you in the Financial Times for months. They called the founder a reclusive genius. I had no idea." Beatrice Atherton, the gossip columnist, pushed her way through, her professional snark replaced by a fawning urgency. "Ms. Dubois, a truly astonishing evening. Could you give us a comment on your acquisition and your re-emergence?" Josie was calm amidst the chaos. She gave a gracious nod to Robert and a non-committal smile to Beatrice. "The foundation does wonderful work," she said, her voice carrying easily over the din. "And it was a beautiful painting." Across the room, Preston and Bianca were frozen in a tableau of humiliation. They were suddenly radioactive. The sycophants who had orbited them all evening now avoided their gaze, their attention fixed on the new center of gravity. Bianca's face was a mess of confusion and horror. Her entire identity was predicated on being the wife of the most powerful man in the room. In the span of 5 minutes, that title had been violently stripped from her and handed to the woman she despised. Preston, however, was experiencing something far more profound than social embarrassment. He was a man who understood numbers, who built his empire on them. He had received a divorce settlement figure. He had calculated Josie's theoretical net worth. The number 10 million tossed out for a piece of art did not compute, but the name Aura Analytics did. He had heard the whispers on Wall Street. He knew the valuation. He had even ironically had his own analyst prepare a memo on the mysterious company, dismissing it as another overinflated tech bubble. The woman he had discarded, the woman he considered intellectually inferior, the woman he believed was incapable of balancing a checkbook without his help, was the reclusive genius the entire financial world was chasing. The thought was so paradigm-shattering, so fundamentally destabilizing, that he felt a wave of dizziness. He watched as a man he recognized, Nathaniel Shaw, a sharp, highly respected investigative journalist from Bloomberg, approached Josie. Unlike the others, Shaw wasn't fawning. His approach was quiet, respectful. His eyes filled with an intense, intelligent curiosity. "Ms. Dubois," Nate said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Nate Shaw. I wrote a piece on Aura's Series B funding last month. I've been trying to get a comment from your office for weeks." "I've read your work, Mr. Shaw," Josie replied, a hint of a genuine smile touching her lips. "You were the only one who correctly identified the potential application of our algorithm for sovereign debt analysis." "So it's not just corporate risk." Nate pressed his reporter's instincts, firing on all cylinders. "Corporate risk is just the beginning," she said, her gaze flickering for a brief second towards Preston. It was a micro-expression, but Nate caught it. "We found the true vulnerabilities aren't in the companies themselves, but in the over-leveraged, interconnected asset classes they're built on. Like commercial real estate, for instance." A cold dread, colder than anything he'd ever felt, began to seep into Preston's bones. Over-leveraged commercial real estate. That was the exact phrase his own CFO had used in a worried tone just last week, a concern Preston had arrogantly brushed aside. His latest greatest acquisition, the one he had boasted about on this very stage, was financed with an astronomical amount of debt secured against his existing properties. It was a house of cards, but he believed he was the only one who knew how it was built. He scrambled for his phone, his hands trembling slightly. He needed to call his head of analytics, his CFO, someone. He pushed through the gawking crowd, Bianca trailing helplessly behind him, calling his name. He ignored her. He found a deserted hallway near the service corridors, the opulent sounds of the Gala fading behind him. He jabbed at his phone, his call going straight to voicemail. He tried another number, voicemail again. It was after 11 p.m., but in his world his calls were always answered. He leaned against the cold marble wall, his chest tight. He remembered Josie in the final years of their marriage, always on her laptop in the library, surrounded by books with titles he didn't understand. He had mocked her for it. "What are you studying for, Josie, the advanced housewifery degree?" He had assumed it was a hobby, a pathetic attempt to feel relevant. He now saw those years with horrifying clarity. She wasn't pursuing a hobby. She was building a weapon forged in the fires of his own condescension and neglect, and it had been pointed at him silently for years. He stumbled back towards the Gala, drawn by a morbid need to see. The scene had changed. Josie was no longer surrounded. She was walking, flanked by Nate Shaw and a formidable-looking woman he didn't recognize, who must have been her private security. They were heading for the exit. Josie moved with an unhurried, regal grace. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. As she passed the table where he and Bianca sat isolated and exposed, her eyes met his one last time. There was no triumph in her gaze, no hatred. There was nothing at all. It was the detached, dispassionate look of a scientist observing a failed experiment. That look was more devastating than any words. It told him that this wasn't about revenge. He wasn't that important. This was simply business. His empire, his legacy, his name, they were just data points in her algorithm. And the analysis was complete. The moment she was gone, it was as if a spell was broken. Preston's phone buzzed in his hand. It was his CFO. He answered, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Preston." His CFO's voice was strained, panicked. "We have a problem. A massive one. A research paper was just published online about 10 minutes ago. It's from a firm called Aura Analytics. It's a complete systematic takedown of our debt structure. It's exposed everything, Preston. Every shell corporation. Every leveraged asset. The Asian markets open in 5 hours. By the time the bell rings in New York tomorrow, we're going to be wiped out." Preston slid down the wall, the phone slipping from his grasp and clattering onto the marble floor. He had stood on that stage and called himself a king. Now, in the wreckage of his own arrogance, he finally understood. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had created the very force that would bring about his ruin. The sun rose on Friday morning over a city that was about to witness a massacre. Not on a battlefield, but on the sterile, unforgiving trading floors of Wall Street. The Aura Analytics report, which had been uploaded to a secure server for financial subscribers at precisely 11:15 p.m. Eastern Time. The exact moment Josie left the Gala was a document of brutal surgical precision. Titled, "Systemic Fragility in Diversified Real Estate Portfolios. The Carmichael Properties Case Study." It was a 90-page evisceration. It didn't use inflammatory language. It didn't need to. It used cold, hard data visualized in a series of damning charts and predictive models. It showed with irrefutable logic how Preston's latest acquisition was not a stroke of genius but a reckless, ego-driven gamble. It detailed how he had leveraged the company's core assets to their absolute limit, creating a debt cascade so fragile that a minor downturn in the commercial leasing market would trigger a complete collapse. Josie's algorithm hadn't just identified the weakness, it had wargamed it. The report included projections showing a 97.4% probability of insolvency within 6 months. The fallout began in the East. As the Tokyo and Hong Kong markets opened, institutional investors who held Carmichael bonds began to dump them. The price cratered. By the time London opened, the panic had spread. The company's credit rating was slashed from A to junk status in the span of 3 hours. In his Park Avenue penthouse, Preston Carmichael watched the carnage unfold on a bank of television screens. He hadn't slept. His face was pale and drawn, his bespoke silk pajamas rumpled. He had been on the phone all night screaming at bankers, lawyers, and board members, but their voices, once so deferential, had turned cold and distant. The king was dead. No one was taking orders from a corpse. Bianca was a ghost in their own home. The diamonds from the night before sat on her vanity, looking like cheap glass. Her social world had already imploded. Her phone was a torrent of texts, some feigning concern, others coldly asking for the return of borrowed items. The wives of Preston's business partners, who had been her closest confidants, were now silent. She had hitched her star to a rocket she thought was headed for the sun. She had never considered it might crash back to Earth. At 9:30 a.m. in New York, the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange sounded like a death knell. Carmichael Properties, stock ticker symbol CPX, opened down 70%. Trading was halted within the first 5 minutes due to the sheer volume of sell orders. When it reopened, it plunged further. Billions of dollars in market capitalization vanished in minutes. The media frenzy was relentless. Bloomberg, The Wall Street Journal, Forbes. Every major financial news outlet was running the story, and the narrative was irresistible. It wasn't just a corporate collapse. It was a Shakespearean drama. The scorned wife, the brilliant mind hidden in plain sight, the hubristic husband brought down by the woman he had so spectacularly underestimated. The photo of Josie, calm and elegant at the gala, was juxtaposed with a haggard-looking Preston taken by a paparazzo outside his office building that morning. While Preston's world burned, Josie's was being forged in the heat. The offices of Aura Analytics, located in a sleek, unmarked building in the meatpacking district, were a hive of calm, focused activity. The space was minimalist and modern, more like a university research lab than a corporate headquarters. There were no corner offices. Josie's desk was in the middle of the open-plan floor, identical to everyone else's. She arrived at 7 a.m., dressed not in haute couture, but in simple tailored slacks and a silk blouse. She gathered her core team, a collection of brilliant young data scientists and market analysts she had headhunted from MIT, Stanford, and CERN. They had all known this day was coming. They had run the models 100 times. "Status report," she said, her voice even. There was no gloating, no celebration. This was the result of a long, complex equation, and the solution was now playing out. The cascade is performing exactly as the model predicted. A young analyst named Ben reported, pointing to a massive screen displaying a complex web of financial connections. The bond default triggers will kick in by midday. The banks that underwrote the loan for the new acquisition are exposed. Their stock is starting to dip. It's contained for now, but the contagion is real. Nate Shaw from Bloomberg is requesting an exclusive interview, her head of communications added. He wants to do a full profile, the woman who broke the Carmichael Code. Josie considered it for a moment. "Grant it," she said, "but on one condition. The focus isn't on the revenge narrative. The focus is on the power of the data. This isn't about Preston, it's about a systemic flaw that he exploited and exemplified. He's the symptom, not the disease. The story is the algorithm." It was a masterful pivot. She was already controlling the narrative, elevating her story from a simple tale of personal vengeance to a parable about the hidden risks in the modern economy. She wasn't just a scorned ex-wife. She was a visionary, a reformer. Late that afternoon, the final domino fell. The board of Carmichael Properties, in an emergency meeting, voted to oust Preston as chairman and CEO. He was forced to resign in disgrace. News cameras captured him leaving his office for the last time, carrying a single cardboard box, his face a gray mask of defeat. The empire he had spent a lifetime building had crumbled to dust in less than 24 hours. That evening, Josie stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office, looking out at the city skyline. On her desk lay the deed of ownership for the painting Starlight on the Hudson. It had been delivered that afternoon. She hadn't even uncrated it yet. The acquisition of the painting felt like a lifetime ago. It had been the catalyst, the spark that lit the fuse, but the explosion that followed had been years in the making. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Chloe. "I'm watching the news. I have no words. Only, wow! Dinner and a whole bottle of champagne on me tonight." Josie smiled, a real unburdened smile. She typed back, "I'll bring a second bottle." This was never about destroying Preston. It was about building herself. His destruction was merely a byproduct, a necessary clearing of the rubble, so that her own foundation built on intellect, hard work, and resilience could finally see the sun. The ghost had not only come back to haunt the Gala, she had burned the whole haunted house to the ground. 3 months later, the dust had settled, leaving behind a radically altered landscape. Preston Carmichael was a pariah. Wiped out financially by margin calls and lawsuits from furious investors, he was forced to sell the Park Avenue penthouse and the Hamptons estate for pennies on the dollar to cover his debts. Bianca, seeing no future in a life without limitless credit and social standing, had quietly filed for divorce. Her name appearing in the gossip columns one last time as she reportedly fled to Europe with a minor aristocrat. Preston was last seen by a photographer looking gaunt and lost, sipping coffee alone at a diner in Queens. He had become the one thing he feared most insignificant. Josephine Dubois, however, was just getting started. The Bloomberg profile written by Nate Shaw, titled The Oracle of Aura, had made her a global figure. She was no longer a reclusive genius, but the face of a new era of data-driven finance. She was lauded not as a corporate raider, but as a truth-teller who had exposed a dangerous rot in the system. Governments and sovereign wealth funds were now vying for Aura Analytics' services, seeking to insulate their own economies from Carmichael-style collapses. The $10 million painting Starlight on the Hudson now hung in the main reception area of her company's new expanded headquarters, overlooking the very same skyline it depicted. It served as a constant reminder not of victory, but of purpose. One crisp autumn afternoon, Josie stood before the painting lost in thought when Nate Shaw was announced. He had become a regular presence ostensibly for follow-up questions for a book he was writing, but their conversations often veered into more personal territory. "It's still breathtaking," he said, coming to stand beside her. "It is," Josie agreed. Finch saw the beauty, but he also saw the structure beneath it. The steel and the stone that hold it all up. Most people just see the lights. "That's what your algorithm does, isn't it?" Nate mused. "It sees the steel and stone of the financial world, and it can tell which beams are about to buckle." "Something like that," she smiled. "We're expanding. We're developing a new model to predict supply chain vulnerabilities based on geopolitical and climate data. The potential applications are significant." "And Preston?" Nate asked quietly. It was the first time his name had been mentioned between them in weeks. Josie's expression didn't change. She continued to gaze at the painting. "I heard he's trying to get a job as a real estate consultant. I hold no ill will towards him. You can't hate a variable once the equation has been solved. He's irrelevant to the new model." It was the truth. The burning anger and the need for vindication had cooled, leaving behind a serene, centered strength. Her final act at the Gala hadn't been about tearing him down. It had been about announcing her own arrival. "I have a reservation for 2 at a new place downtown tonight," Nate said, changing the subject. "If you're not busy modeling the future of global commerce, that is." She turned to him, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "I think I can take one evening off to focus on the present." Later that day, just before she left to meet Nate, she had one final unexpected encounter. A letter had been delivered by courier. The handwriting on the envelope was shaky, but instantly recognizable. It was from Preston. Her first instinct was to throw it away unread, but curiosity and perhaps a need for final closure made her open it. The letter inside was short, just a few lines on cheap plain paper. Josie. I suppose you expect me to say, I'm sorry. I am, but not for the reasons you think. I'm not sorry I lost the money or the company. I'm sorry I was such a fool. I had a masterpiece in my own home for 20 years, and I was too blind to see its value. I was looking at the canvas, but I never saw the art. Preston Josie read the note, then read it again. There was no request for help, no plea for forgiveness. It was just a stark, simple admission of his own blindness. She folded the piece of paper and placed it not in the trash, but in a desk drawer. It was the final data point of a closed chapter. As she rode the elevator down to the lobby, she caught her reflection in the polished steel. She saw the woman in the midnight blue dress, the woman who had once felt invisible. But now she saw everything else. She had become a founder, an innovator, a leader. She had spent 5 years in the quiet building her own world, while the man who had left her celebrated his. But she had learned something fundamental. You don't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes all you need to do is change the world so profoundly that your silence becomes the loudest sound in the room. And then when the time is right, you speak. What an incredible story of transformation and vindication. Josephine's journey reminds us that the world's perception of you is not your reality. While others were judging her by her past, she was quietly, diligently building a future that would render their opinions meaningless. Her story isn't just about revenge. It's about the immense power of self-belief, intellect, and the courage to redefine your own worth on your own terms. It proves that sometimes the greatest success comes not from reclaiming an old life, but from building a new one that is so much bigger. What did you think of Josie's epic power move at the auction? Was it the ultimate revenge, or simply a brilliant business decision? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of resilience and triumph, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribing to the channel for more true-life dramatic stories. Your support helps us bring these incredible tales to light. Thanks for listening.